Everyone, welcome to the Space Environment session on plasma and magnetosphere. Our first speaker is Andrew Poppe from Space Sciences Lab of Berkeley, and he'll talk about the lunar paleo-magnetosphere fractionation of solar wind minor ion flux. So in the next 10 minutes.
This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, thank you, Dario. I will go ahead and share and get started. So let's see. Okay, just to check, does that come through nicely, Daru?
Yes.
Okay, good. So thank you for joining so early for those of us in the West Coast, or in the late afternoon for those of you in Europe. My name is Andrew, and on behalf of myself and my co-authors, Ian Garrick Bethel and Shahab Fatemi, I'm happy to talk about the lunar paleo-magnetosphere and the implications this has for fractionation of solar wind minor ion flux to the lunar surface. So the overarching motivation for this work is that we know that lunar soil samples taken from the surface and returned to the lab on Earth by the astronauts record implanted solar wind material. So the cute little cartoon I show on the left is generally to depict outflowing material from the solar wind. Obviously, it's primarily composed of protons, but there is a long list of minor ion species that are also present in the solar wind. Perhaps the most well-known minor ion is solar wind alphas or helium-4, but this extends all the way out in the periodic table, all the way out to xenon, potentially higher. And these elements are actually really remarkably important to study because they are not generated by nucleosynthesis in the sun. They are actually quote unquote primordial, and they originate from the protoplanetary disk out of which the sun and the solar system formed. So by measuring these minor trace ion species, we can actually learn about the composition of the protoplanetary disk. As these ions are being emitted from the sun, they're recorded, they're implanted deep into the regolith of the moon. And a lot of research has gone on to looking at variations in different isotopes of these samples, especially as a function of time. So the figure on the right is adapted from a review paper by Rainer Wieler et al. In 2016. And what he showed is that if you take certain ratios, here, for example, argon to krypton or krypton to xenon, and you compare that ratio between different aged samples, between old samples, which are more than 1 billion years old, young samples, which are less than 100 million years old, you can see isotopic variations. So some are enriched in argon versus krypton, some are enriched in krypton versus xenon. And one of the questions is, why might this be? Is it telling us something about the sun's variability as a function of time? That's one possibility. The other possibility, and that's what I'll talk about here, is that the moon is actually playing a little bit of funny business with us, and it's actually modifying these fluxes to some degree just before they're implanted in the surface. So the motivation for this study is to try and understand what role the moon is playing in potentially altering these isotopic ratios from the sun. So we know through really a nice body of research that the moon had a dynamo, and actually that dynamo existed up to approximately 1 billion years ago. So for almost 3/4 of the moon's life, it had some sort of dynamo and global magnetic field. The figure on the left is from a recent paper by Mihani et al. 2020. And what they generally show is that the dynamo existed in a very high field epoch. This is tens to 100 microtesla. That's on the order of the Earth's field. And that was early in the moon's lifetime, about 4 billion to 3.5 billion years ago. Somewhere around 3 billion years ago, this dropped to a more moderate level, about 5 microtesla, that apparently lasted for actually almost half the moon's lifetime, for about 3.5, maybe up to 1 billion years ago. And then finally, after about 1 billion years ago, the dynamo completely shut off and was done. But the implications of this are that actually for most of the moon's lifetime, it had a dynamo, and by extension, it must have had a paleo-magnetosphere. So along those ideas, Garrick Bethel et al. In 2019 performed some initial simulations using a hybrid model to look at what the structure of this magnetosphere would look like. It's very reminiscent of what we see at Mercury, but about a factor of 10 higher. Mercury's field is about 0.3 microtesla on average, whereas the moon is thought to be about 5 microtesla in this epoch. But what you can clearly see is that a very well-formed magnetosphere appears. And so what implication does this perhaps have for the inflowing solar wind and how that solar wind is implanted into the lunar soil. So that begs the question, and something we kind of coined magnetospheric fractionation. So fractionation is a general type of process of anytime you get differing responses based on the mass of an isotope. So you can separate isotopes and get different ratios. Here we coined the term magnetospheric fractionation, which not only depends on the mass of the isotope, but actually the charge state, because we're talking about electromagnetic interactions. So the question we posed in this study was, does the charge to mass ratio of all of these minor ions, all of these minor isotopes, actually affect differing rates at which these ions are implanted in the lunar soil? So high charge to mass ratio, these are typically lighter ions like protons or alphas. Are they more likely to be deflected by the bow shock, the magnetosheath of this magnetosphere? Whereas low charge to mass ratio, these are typically heavier ions. Are they able to penetrate a little bit more and get down to the surface? And there you could stretch out this fractionation as a function of mass as well as charge to mass ratio. So the hint here is that, yes, this absolutely does impact the flux of material down to the lunar surface. So to quantify that, we first ran a whole bunch of base simulations for the lunar paleomagnetosphere, first looking at the different strengths of the dynamo and therefore the different strength of the surface magnetic field. So shown here are 8 simulations. The first one on the left is for no paleomagnetic field. This is basically akin to the current day state of the moon. You see there's no structure upstream of the moon, and we see a nice wake in the density behind the moon. That's essentially what's seen today. If we then turn on the paleomagnetic field starting at a fairly low value, only 62 nanotesla or so, and increase it by factors of 2, as we get all the way up to 4 microtesla, you can see a nice suite of growing configurations of the lunar paleomagnetosphere. The closest one we get is about 4 microtesla. This is very close to the estimated value in the middle of the moon's lifetime of about 5 microtesla. So this is generally close. This lower right panel is generally close to what we think the median value for the moon's magnetosphere was for most of its lifetime. So this provides us with a base set of what we think the lunar paleomagnetosphere would look like. And through these background electromagnetic fields that we've then simulated, we actually tracked a large range of heavy minor ion species. So this is everything from alpha particles, which are sort of the lightest heavy ion species, all the way out to ions that essentially replicate the behavior of xenon, which is very heavy at 132 AMP. I show an example here of the different types of structure you get. This is for a single magnetic field strength. This is for 1 microtesla. But now each of these panels is showing you a heavier and heavier minor ion in the solar wind. The general shape of the interaction is the same. We see the bow shock, we see the lobes, we see the dayside cavity carved out. But if you sort of pay attention and look at some of the finer details much closer as you increase in mass, you can see that there is actually changing precipitation to the lunar surface as a function of mass. There's a number of notable features. You can see the striations in the bow shock. That actually has to do with essentially the gyro radius of these ions as they interact with the bow shock. But from these sets of simulations, we then computed the precipitating flux of these ions onto the surface. So if you look closely, for example, you can see flux precipitating in through the cusp regions of these magnetic fields, and trapped radiation-like belt particles that also precipitate to the surface. So from all of these simulations, we have a huge library. We essentially computed the relative flux of different isotopes down to the lunar surface. And that's what's shown here. We show a comparison of the argon to krypton ratios, the krypton to xenon ratios, and the solid black dots are essentially what we pulled out from the model as a function of magnetic field strength. And the dashed lines are comparing, going back to that first Wheeler et al. Paper, the old lunar ratio and the young lunar ratio. So there's a little bit of isotopic deviation between these. And we can clearly see that just this simple test of running different paleomagnetic field strengths very much changes the isotopic ratios of these well within the range that is actually observed in the samples. So the goal is not necessarily to show that this exact field strength was at the moon, but simply to show that if you did have a paleomagnetosphere, you can torque these isotopic ratios all over the map, and could be one potential explanation for the variations we see in the lunar soil samples. So just to briefly review the key points, we know that the lunar soil records samples from the sun. We know that the moon possessed a paleo-magnetosphere up to about 1 billion years ago. We know that this paleo-magnetosphere would have led to significant effects on these precipitating ions and would actually have caused some amount of this isotopic fractionation in these soil samples. And all of the details that I very quickly glossed over in that talk are available in a recent paper in the Planetary Science Journal. So if you're curious, you can check that out, or you can send me an email for more questions. So thank you.
All right, very nice. Thank you, Andrew. There's one question from Prabal Saxena in the chat window. And the question is, do you expect to see latitudinal variation in abundance or fractionation based on the models, depending on where the particles may have been also traveled through open field lines?
Yes, absolutely. That's an excellent question. And in the paper, I actually have a couple plots of what the latitudinal precipitation fluxes look like. So you get precipitation concentrated in the cusps. You sometimes get belts of precipitation caused by these sort of trapped particle regions. So the answer is yes, you get very inhomogeneous precipitation on the surface. There's lots more details in the paper, but that's a good point.
And I guess this could also be the diagnostic of the magnetic field.
Yeah, it's dependent on not only the strength, but actually the orientation of the paleo pole, which is a whole nother set of simulations to be done. So.
Thank you, Andrew.
Okay.